celebrating the power of possibility.
Hello, my name is Jeff Arnett, and I believe that anything is possible.
Jeff Arnett, welcome to Anything is Possible.
Thank you for having me today.
These are great stories about great people whose lives prove that anything is possible. Your life is proof of concept. And I'm excited to have you at this table today. Jackson, Tennessee.
Yes.
Did you have any idea growing up in Jackson, Tennessee, that you would be CEO of a distilling company?
I did not. Because, even though Tennessee is kind of famous for distilling, growing up in West Tennessee, there were no distilleries in that area. So I would say my world was pretty small. My grandfather worked for the railroad. My father worked for the railroad. The only career advice I can remember my father giving me was don't work for the railroad. So that left a lot of things for me to consider. But, in high school, I was always pretty good at math and science. So I think going after an engineering degree made sense for me. And when I was 16, in a moment of weakness, my father gave me the keys to a car, and it looked like the Smokey and the Bandit Trans Am, and I was in hog heaven. The car got like 9 miles to the gallon. It had no working air conditioning, but I had decided that working in the automotive field was something that I wanted to do. So I went away to college, got an engineering degree, did a co-op with Bendix Brakes, which was part of Allied Signal, so they owned Fram, Bendix, and Autolite. They were there in Jackson, Tennessee. But when I came out of college, it was a terrible time in the U.S. automotive industry. They were laying off people at General Motors, and there just wasn't work to be found there. So the largest industrial employer in my hometown was Procter & Gamble. And my parents didn't work for them, but they had a great reputation in town as being a good company to work for. So I thought, I could clearly do worse than getting a job with them. So I sent a resume to them. And they told me at the time they weren't going to hire in the Jackson plant. The Jackson plant made Duncan Hines cake mixes and frostings and also Pringles potato chips. But they told me they had an opening in that same sector, the food and beverage sector, if I was willing to move to New Orleans. So I went and interviewed at the Folger Coffee Company in New Orleans as I was graduating from college, and that's where I took my first job.
Now, my producer, Chris Marion, loves Folgers, right?
Yeah.
So you go to work for Procter & Gamble, Folgers brand, to do what? Were they using your brain and your taste buds?
At that point, I didn't really know what my taste bud abilities were, if I had, a gift for the sensory sciences or not. But I came down there to be a production manager for them. So they tended to hire engineers, and then they taught them how to manage and their company philosophy. So that was part of their, they felt like it was easier for them to tell you how they wanted you to manage and to bring in people who felt like they already knew how to manage and they had to break those habits. So coming in, I was really more of just a technical person, understood how to manage a process, and then you learned how to manage people as part of that. But the New Orleans plant was important to Folgers because it was strategically located. If you think about where coffee is grown, it comes from Central and South America, so it would be easy to bring it up through the Gulf of Mexico into the port of New Orleans. So there was a large commodities market where coffee beans were bought, sold, traded. So we didn't have to go very far. We could send somebody from the New Orleans plant across town. They would pick up a pound or two of all the different coffee beans that were being brought into the country. And we could bring them back into the plant, roast and grind and brew them individually, and then go through a classing and grading process. So what I called the coffee masters of Folgers, the people who had been in the coffee business for a long time, knew how to taste a bean and evaluate it for flavor, acidity, body, all these different attributes that you would assign to the bean. Being a production manager there, they would invite you to come and sit in. So you sat at a table that was like a lazy Susan, and they would just kind of spin it around, and you would slurp coffee off of a spoon and then kind of spit it into a spittoon and then kind of evaluate its mouthfeel, the flavor, and then grade it and score it the way you saw it. So I began to learn the sensory sciences in coffee and felt like I was pretty good at it because I wasn't a big coffee drinker when I first came to Folgers, but clearly I had become a pretty good connoisseur of it by the time that I left.
What makes one good at what you call the sensory sciences? what makes a good taster of something? How do you know you're good at that?
Well, I think some people have, a more highly sensitive palate than another. I call these hypersensitive palates. I think it's not just what you taste, but where you taste it. And I think once you understand the palate and how it's constructed, that we all tend to taste things in the same zone. So you have sweet and salty on the tip of the tongue. You have sour taste buds on the sides and underneath your tongue. You have bitter taste buds on the back of your tongue and throat. Every liquid is going to have a mouthfeel associated with it as well. So in Japan, that's what they refer to as umami, or what I would call the savory zone. So liquids can be like water in the mouth. They can be like milk. They can be slightly oily, kind of clinging. So those are all things that are part of the drinking experience. But I tell people, if you put a liquid in the mouth and it seems like the flavor is more on the tip of the tongue, that's a sweet liquid, regardless of maybe the flavors that you would describe in it. The more it tends to fall in the back of the throat, the more bitter it is. And I always say, every time you say bitter, it kind of has a negative connotation associated with it, but really it isn't. It's the difference in, people express an opinion typically. If they like milk chocolate is going to be sweeter, it's going to be more on the tip of the tongue, but a lot of people don't like milk chocolate. They would prefer like a high cocoa, a dark chocolate. It's more of a semi-sweet or slightly bitter. And those fall more on the back of the throat. So I would tell people, when you're tasting a liquid, it's not just what you taste, but it's where you're tasting it that you need to pay attention to, because it's telling you something about it.
So are you super sensitive with your palate, or are you generic with your palate?
I would not describe myself as a super sensitive palate, but because I do understand the anatomy of the tongue, I'm pretty good at breaking liquids down. And especially when it came to like our newest venture, where I was going to be taking some different liquids that I felt like maybe were good, but weren't as complete as they needed to be. They weren't as balanced as they needed to be. I was able to find liquids, one that was sweet but didn't have enough finish on it. I found something that wasn't very sweet that had a lot of finish on it. And you put those two together and you find that you've created balance from them.
Possibility powered by Pilot Flying J, Covenant Health, Home Federal, and the Knoxville News Sentinel.
So you are with Procter & Gamble. You work with the Folgers brand, the Pringles brand.
Yep.
You're developing your understanding of the palate.
Yep.
So you got an engineering mind, you run plants, but you also have to understand products, product quality, and the product experience, the drinking experience.
Absolutely.
And you become, I'd never heard of this before, you become a squire.
Yeah, somewhere along the way, I wasn't in the whiskey industry, and actually to become a squire, you could not work in the spirits industry anywhere. But, I was a native Tennessean. When I went away to college, I went to Alabama. My first job out of Alabama took me to New Orleans. Then I moved to Texas, and I think the more that I was away from Tennessee, the more I kind of missed home. And I think that Jack Daniel's in particular was one of the most iconic products that came from the state of Tennessee, because, people would say, well, where's home for you? And I would say Tennessee, and people go, Jack Daniel's. It would be Elvis, Dolly, and Jack.
Jack.
So it was music or it was whiskey. And when people would invite me over for a party, even if most people were bringing beer or wine or something like that, I would bring a bottle of Jack Daniel's, because I kind of felt like it was, sort of the
calling card.
It was the calling card.
Yeah,
it was the postcard from the state, and it was something I was proud to give. So somebody had recognized me over the years as being a fan of Jack Daniel's. So there's this word of mouth fan club that's existed for Jack Daniel's since the mid 50s. And this dates back to the time when Frank Sinatra, Jack Daniel's was largely an unknown brand, but Frank Sinatra had, come across it, had become a fan of it. He holds it up on stage and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Jack Daniel's, and it's the nectar of the gods." So when that happened, Jack Daniel's sales doubled the next year. And I always say, if you're vodka, that's great because you just make more of it. But if it's whiskey, that's not a good thing, because it takes years. And you would have had to have planned for that years prior so that you had aged product prepared to do that. So Jack Daniel's went on allocation for about 25 years. So from 1955 to around 1980, they could not make enough. And when people were ordering it, they might say, I want 50 cases, and they might get 30 or 40 cases.
Wow.
So it was going out in the market, but not at the rate that people wanted it. But during those shortage periods, they felt like they didn't want to lose customers. So if they were walking into stores and the bottle wasn't on the shelf, they asked store owners to take down names and addresses. They started a letter writing campaign. as part of that, the word squire means you're a landowner. So that was actually like a social class of people. So when you became a squire, they gave you a square inch of property inside the hollow where the whiskey was made.
Wow.
So everybody has a plot number, and they would write you letters from time to time. I was getting letters that basically told me what was going on my land, but mostly it was always just to, keep us top of mind, and we would love to see you sometime.
What was your favorite Jack Daniel's product?
My knowledge of Jack Daniel's didn't go much beyond the square black label bottle of Tennessee whiskey. Old Number 7 was my go-to, and I think part of that was. I would drink it with, when I first started, I was mostly a beer drinker when I was in college. And when I first started drinking whiskey, I ordered a Jack and Coke because I really didn't know anything else to order. I had limited knowledge. But I began to realize that it was like, at first it was sort of like Jack and Coke, and then it was more like Jack and Coke, So you really more and more that I really enjoy the flavor of the whiskey more than the Coke, and I don't really want the sweet, coming along with that. So I became more and more of a neat or a rocks drinker. When I got to Jack Daniel's, being quality control there meant that I had to oversee the consistency of all the Old Number 7 Tennessee whiskey for the world, because it was all being made in that one spot. But I began to become more aware of like their double mellow version, which was Gentleman Jack, and how to distinguish it in a taste panel. So if somebody presented that to me blind, if somebody put 3 glasses in front of me.
You can tell.
Yeah, that 2 of them have Old Number 7 Tennessee whiskey in it, and one of those glasses had Gentleman Jack in it, I could taste through them and pull that glass out. And I wouldn't necessarily tell you it was Gentleman Jack, but I would tell you, this glass doesn't have as much finish. It's softer, it's sweeter, and that's exactly what you want Gentleman Jack to be. So I would describe it in the terms of what the brand should be, not always knowing which one I would be pulling out. But then, of course, single barrel is the one product that had no absolute standard of identity. So I was one of 2 people that tasted every single barrel that left Jack Daniel's for a 5-year period. So it was really
tasted every barrel.
So over the course of a day, there might be 40 or 50 single barrels that would be processed and be prepared for bottling. I would be one of 2 people that would go through, taste every single one of those, and decide if it met the standards. And mostly it was, I called it lopping the heads and tails off. You didn't want anything that would twist someone's mouth sideways, and you didn't want something out there that was low character, because the sort of the nature of a single barrel is that it should have a lot of flavor. I always say it could be really sweet or it could be really oaky, but you just wanted it to be really something and not low character.
How'd you go from being a squire to being the master distiller at the legendary Jack Daniel's, and the first person not from Lynchburg to hold that title, and the first person not to die or retire with that title?
When I first came to Jack Daniel's, I think a lot of squires, if you were to ask them, their dream would be to quit whatever job they have today and to find something at Jack Daniel's, a job that they could do. So just, getting a job there. When I was leaving Procter & Gamble was a great company, but they were selling off all of their food brands, which prompted me to kind of get a resume prepared and to try to take my destiny in my own hands, because I was going to be sold to another company if I stayed. Didn't really target Jack Daniel's. I just found a headhunter in the Nashville area. He saw my resume, saw all the food and beverage, manufacturing and quality background that I had, and he had presented it to Jack Daniel's. And once they saw my resume, they had an opening for a quality control manager back in 2001. So that was a job that I interviewed for. And when I got there, I didn't immediately say, well, I'm going to be the next master distiller. My philosophy has always been, I always try to work towards the next goal. So I didn't want to be the quality control manager or only the quality control manager forever. I still wanted to continue to grow and develop in my career, but I didn't say I'm going to replace Jimmy Bedford. To be honest, I already felt like they most likely had identified someone, because to your point, all the master distillers before me had kind of grown up in the shadows of that distillery. They were from that community. They were legacy type candidates, and I wasn't. So when I got there, I was like, I will be the general manager. To me, that was the job that I needed to target. So I actually went back and got a master's in business, because I looked at the history of the general manager's role there, and they tended to go after people with accounting and finance backgrounds and not engineers. So I was trying to prove to them that I could handle the dollars and cents of the distillery as much as I could take water, grains, yeast, distill, and mellow and mature the whiskey for them. So that was sort of my philosophy there, was just, I'm just going to try to do a really good job with whatever they entrust me with.
that life philosophy, I'm gonna do a really good job with whatever they entrusted to me.
Yep.
That sounds like good raising.
Well, you know,
Where's that come from?
You know, my parents are very different. You know, my father he went to business college for a few months, decided it was not for him. He joined the railroad when he was 19 and he worked there for the next 42 years. My mother, on the other hand, went to school, got her master's degree, had her master's plus 50, was a K through 12 certified guidance counselor. So she had, you know, spent her years in schools working with kids, trying to help them find their way, find their gifts, helping them kind of get prepared to go to college if that was what was best for them. So, you know, she was in my ear about those things too. I spent my first year in college, not in engineering, but in pre-med. And that was really not for me as much as it was for my mom. My mom said, you know, she felt like I was smart enough to be a doctor, therefore I should be a doctor. That was her reasoning. But after 1 year in pre-med, I just began to realize my heart was not in that. And I was in the classroom with people who had wanted to be doctors for a long time. And you can kind of see the passion that that's what they wanted to be. And I'm like, I just don't share that. And I know it's a long road and I'm going to burn out if I try to go that path. I have an uncle who actually I've more modeled most of my life and career around, who actually ironically worked for Alcoa. So he graduated from UT Knoxville, went to work for Alcoa. We actually bought land that was part of the complex where his first job was for a company distilling now. But you know, he's the one who had the engineering background. He's the one who went back and got a master's in business and went on to be a plant manager and ultimately start his own company in the aluminum space. So just kind of, you know, I always say that my dad—
You were around people
yeah,
who
were ambitious,
excellent.
who sought education and were ambitious, even though, and I would just say that, you know, what I got from my dad, my mom would say reach for the stars, but my dad would tell me, keep your feet on the ground and keep pushing forward because nothing, don't expect anything to be handed to you. You know, you're going to have to work for whatever you're going to get in life.
You end up as the master distiller.
and that was not the path that I really expected to be on. So, you know, once I had gotten to Jack Daniel's, I was the quality control manager. It was normally, I would say that that's not an enviable job anywhere because quality, you have a lot of responsibilities on you, but you don't have a lot of authority. Typically, you're sort of in a service role there, so the people who run production have a lot of the say of what the people are going to do, and you have to win support. You know, you have to go and kind of sell things to people. You can't demand it. So I had to kind of prove to them that the thing I was asking them to do were in their best interest and were going to save them pain down the road. So just learning how to, you know, sell the ideas and things that you had. So I began to make relationships with the people who were in power there. They were impressed that they could actually measure the improvements in quality that were happening while I was there. But they'd given me the single barrel processing area because it was the most scrutinized. It was the level of quality was, you know, required the most checks to make it out the door. Sort of like he's quality control, let him manage that. And then doing well in those two positions, they were like, we'd like you to take over all the processing and warehousing operations. So, you know, by the time I left, the warehousing was over 90 warehouses. There were 2.5 million barrels in storage. We had historical data on all those warehouses and when we expected barrels to be ready, you know, the color, character, flavor, and everything to arrive. I had been with Jack Daniel's for about 5 years when I was first promoted to take over processing and warehousing. And that was when they first spoke to me about my interest level in being master distiller. So even though it was a couple of years later when they officially offered me that, I wasn't completely caught off guard. But the thing that most concerned me, in being honest about it, is the master distiller before me, he kind of made the job what he wanted it to be, and he wanted to see the world. You know, he had one daughter, she was grown and gone, and he saw it as an opportunity to travel the world. So over half the days of the year, for the time that he was master distiller, he was out in the market. When they offered that to me, my kids were 3 and 1. And I'm like, I cannot be gone half the days of the year and still feel like I'm, you know, a success at home. So it was like, you know, is the career that important, or are there other things, you know, priorities that I'm going to have? I don't want to look back on my life with regrets and be a father that my children didn't know because I was never home. So that was my first concern that I expressed back to them. I'm like, I am absolutely honored to be in this conversation, that you would even consider me to be the master distiller here, because I understand the importance of that role. But I don't want to orphan my kids for it. So if we can limit travel, then I might be your guy, but Just let me know if that's agreeable. So 2 years later, they came back to me and said, we would like you to be the master distiller. We think you've done a great job. But would you travel 20% of the time? You don't have to be gone half the days of the year. So 50 to 60 days a year. Are you up for that? And I'd had 2 years to talk to my wife about it.
So you got it worked out.
Yeah, so we had already worked it out, and she said, I think it would be an excellent opportunity. In the early years, even while my kids were still young, it was a good time for us because I had a mother-in-law. We had a support system, so we could let the kids stay with grandparents, and she traveled with me. So over the next 12 years that I was master distiller, I went to 41 different countries, and my wife went to 25 of those with me. So we were able to make some great memories out on the road. But I would tell you that's an exhausting thing too, because you would go across all these time zones. You would get off of a plane. Ooh. You don't know what day it is, what time it is, what meal you're supposed to be eating, but you're supposed to be sharp. You're supposed to hit the stage and be high energy and act like you want to be there, even when you feel completely out of sorts.
You have to figure out a way to do
You
that.
do. I mean, so you had to find, even when the tank was empty, you had to find a way to, run on fumes at times. But it was an honor at the same time, and I got a chance to see a lot of the world that I would have never seen otherwise.
Jeff Arnett is my guest on Anything Is Possible. In part 2 of our conversation, we got to talk about leaving Jack Daniel's, which most people never do. Once you get there, you stay. But you've decided to jump out into a brand new adventure that's going to mean a lot for redefining distilling in East Tennessee. This is Anything Is Possible.